The sound was nothing short of hellish, a cacophony of tortured screams, like demons shrieking in agony, slicing through the crisp night air loud enough to rouse the entire neighborhood. I shot upright in bed, heart pounding in my chest, but I already knew exactly what had triggered the noise. My motion alarm had done its job, and not just any alarm, the custom one I'd set up specifically for Karen. The unmistakable bleating of distressed goats was blaring from my speakers, signaling that Karen, my lovely neighbor and self-appointed HOA tyrant, was at it again, attempting to cut the lock off my gate. The screams were like the gates of farm animal hell had burst open. I couldn't suppress the grin spreading across my face. By the time I threw on my jacket and rushed outside, the scene was almost comically perfect. Karen, dressed in a ridiculous leopard print pajama set, stood frozen in the middle of the yard like a raccoon caught in headlights. In one hand she gripped a set of bolt cutters, while the other held a half-peeled neighborhood improvement sticker that she probably intended to slap on my gate after breaking in. Her mouth hung open, eyes wide, as every porch light within 2 blocks flicked on, curtains rustled, and sleepy neighbors emerged, some with coffee mugs, others with baseball bats depending on their mood. And through it all, the shrill wail of goat screams blasted, creating an apocalyptic soundtrack to the chaos. I leaned against the fence, arms crossed, and watched Karen squirm. She stumbled over her words, trying to explain to the growing crowd that this was all a misunderstanding. Apparently, she'd heard a distressed animal and was only trying to help. Yeah, sure. A likely story, especially considering the bolt cutters in her hand and the fact that the distressed animal was an audio file I'd uploaded myself. Karen's husband, Greg, stood awkwardly behind her in slippers and a robe, mouthing silent apologies to anyone brave enough to meet his gaze. Bless him, he looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. As the goat screams finally died down and the neighborhood's murmurs filled the air, Karen adjusted her pajama top and with a pointed finger accused me. "Your lock violates HOA guidelines," she snapped. "It's an eyesore." I knew better. Karen had been eyeing my land for months, ever since the HOA expanded its reach. She hated that my little patch of land, barn and all, stood defiantly next to the perfectly manicured lawns and soul-sucking flower beds of the neighborhood. But tonight there was something more to her, something beyond the lock. As she ranted, I noticed her gaze constantly flicking to the old barn behind me. She wasn't concerned about the lock, she was eyeing the land. That uneasy feeling in my stomach grew. What did Karen really want? The next morning Karen wasted no time. She called an emergency HOA meeting, the quickest in neighborhood history. The clubhouse was packed, buzzing like a hive as Karen took the floor, trying to spin herself as the victim. She presented blurry security footage that supposedly showed me terrorizing the neighborhood with unhinged farm animal sounds. She called it harassment, claiming I was disturbing the peace. The room erupted into muffled laughter when someone pointed out the bolt cutters she'd been holding at the time of the alleged harassment. Karen's face turned crimson. I kept my cool, sipping my black coffee, watching her dig her own grave. I knew the HOA board, especially the ones who usually fell for her nonsense, could see through her act. My property had been here long before the HOA existed. I had every right to lock it up, set up alarms, and yes, serenade it with goat screams if I wanted. But Karen wasn't done. She didn't back down or apologize. Instead, she doubled down. When the meeting ended, she cornered me in the parking lot, her eyes blazing with rage. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, her voice low and sharp. "I'm not finished with you." I just smiled, tipped my hat, and reminded her, judging by the goat screams, she wasn't the only one with unfinished business. "You think this is funny?" I said before turning to walk away. But as I headed off, I caught it again, Karen's eyes flicking toward my barn. Not at me, not at the gate, but directly at the barn. Something was brewing, and it wasn't just another one of Karen's usual HOA antics. This wasn't about aesthetics, lock codes, or some petty neighborhood feud. Karen wanted something, and the way her jaw clenched and her eyes narrowed as she stared past me, I knew this was just the beginning. Back home, I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills, the barn casting a dark silhouette against the fading light. I tried to shake it off as just another tantrum from Karen, but something gnawed at me. Why had she risked humiliation and the ridicule of the entire neighborhood over a simple lock? Why now? As I finished my coffee, I made a promise to myself. The next time Karen tried something, I'd be ready. And knowing Karen, it wouldn't be long. Because if there's one thing Karen can't resist, it's other people's property. And if there's one thing I can't resist, it's watching her fail, again and again. A few days passed, and for a moment, it seemed like the goat alarm incident had knocked some sense into Karen. The neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm. Kids shooting hoops after school, retirees trimming their pristine lawns, and the occasional dog barking at squirrels as if it were a full-time job. I almost let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, Karen had accepted defeat. But deep down I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to give up, especially not after a public humiliation. It was early on a Wednesday when I saw them, two men in high-visibility vests and clipboards, walking the property line between my land and the neighborhood's perfect lawns. They didn't look like the usual utility workers. No logos on their vests, no parked work trucks, just two guys with measuring wheels, GPS gear, and faces that screamed business, not repairs. I kept an eye on them from the porch, sipping my coffee as they moved deliberately, measuring and pacing. I didn't have to ask. This had Karen written all over it. Later that afternoon, just as I expected, Karen strolled down the street toward them, Tupperware of muffins in hand, chatting and laughing like old friends. She didn't even notice me watching as she pointed toward the barn, gesturing as if outlining something grand. The men nodded and scribbled notes, continuing their measuring. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a random inspection. Karen was up to something much bigger than a petty argument over a lock. I grabbed the old county land records from the filing cabinet. The farm had been in my family long before the HOA manicured lawns or plastic flamingos ever showed up. As I flipped through the faded deeds and maps, I noticed something I'd never paid much attention to, a survey marker near the back corner of the barn, right where Karen had been pointing. My grandfather had briefly mentioned it in his notes, suggesting that the property line might not have been clearly recorded when the neighborhood was first developed. To anyone else it would just look like part of the HOA's greenbelt, but I knew better. That little patch of land, about a quarter acre, was mine. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept circling back to the image of Karen handing muffins to those men like a mob boss slipping hush money. The next morning I called Rick, my old friend and the county's most stubborn and meticulous land surveyor. Rick had a reputation for treating land surveys like fine art, and I knew he'd jump at the chance to stick it to the HOA, especially Karen. Within hours, Rick showed up with his gear, whistling a tune and carrying 2 thermoses of strong black coffee. We spent the day combing through the property, walking every inch of the fence, measuring twice, marking stakes and comparing notes. Sure enough, the corner behind the barn fell well within my property line. More importantly, it wasn't even in the HOA's recorded map. It was mine, no question about it. Karen wasn't just making noise, she was quietly attempting to stage a land grab. That small patch of land wasn't just a piece of property, it was the key to a future development. The HOA could technically reroute the neighborhood walking path, claim easement rights and pave the way for new construction. Karen wasn't just meddling with the HOA, she was orchestrating a full-on land snatch. That night, I set up more motion sensors and trail cameras around the barn, each one carefully hidden and all linked to my phone. I wasn't about to let Karen or her muffin bribe surveyors pull a fast one. Sure enough, just past midnight, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. This time it wasn't from the gate, it was from the barn. I slipped out the back door, staying low behind the brush, and crept toward the flickering beam of a flashlight near the fence line. There she was. Karen, clipboard in hand, squinting at the property marker that Rick and I had flagged earlier. She scribbled something furiously before pulling out a bundle of plastic signs from her tote bag. One by one she hammered them into the ground. They read, Future site of HOA Community Garden, by order of the HOA Board. I nearly laughed out loud. Karen had no authority to order anything, let alone put up signs on land that wasn't hers. But watching her sneak around like a cartoon villain made me realize just how far she was willing to go. I kept watching, careful not to reveal myself as she moved deeper onto the property, placing more signs and marking off imaginary borders with pink construction tape. The audacity of it all was almost impressive, if it wasn't so pathetic. She wasn't just acting without approval, she was hoping no one would notice until it was too late. My land, my barn, and my future were mere pawns in whatever scheme she was plotting with the HOA. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to cheerful signs announcing the new community garden, courtesy of the HOA. Karen strutted around like a peacock, soaking in compliments and pretending she was spearheading a selfless beautification project. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, playing the long game. If Karen wanted a war, I was going to make sure it was on my terms. As neighbors gathered around, admiring Karen's so-called generosity, I noticed something else. Karen wasn't just enjoying the attention, she was stalling. She kept glancing at her watch, nervously scanning the street. That's when I saw him, a well-dressed man in a sharp suit leaning against a sleek black SUV parked near the entrance to the neighborhood. He wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't with the HOA. And judging by the smug look on his face and the expensive leather folder under his arm, I knew exactly who he was, a developer. It clicked instantly. Karen wasn't after a garden, she was after a payday. That little patch of land behind the barn was the missing piece of some larger project. If she could snatch it without anyone noticing, she could hand it over to the developer on a silver platter in exchange for whatever dirty deal they had brewing. My jaw clenched as I watched Karen shake the man's hand, proudly pointing at the signs. She thought she had won, that no one would stand up to her because who would go against the HOA? What Karen didn't know was that I already had the footage, the documents, and now the motive. She had made a critical mistake, she underestimated me. And she had no idea what I was about to do next. By the next morning, I had a plan, and this time I wasn't settling for just catching Karen red-handed. I was going to make sure that when she went down, the entire neighborhood was watching. I spent the better part of the day upgrading the goat alarm, not just with louder sounds but with something far more terrifying. I rigged it to project holographic images of stampeding goats, ghostly but realistic enough to make anyone jump out of their skin. It was a trick I had learned from a local fairground that used the same setup for their haunted hayride. It wasn't hard to. With some old projectors I had gathering dust in the shed, combined with my trail cams, motion sensors, and a few hidden speakers, the setup was ready. All I needed was for Karen to take the bait. As predictable as ever, Karen didn't disappoint. That evening, I spotted her pacing near the newly posted Future HOA Community Garden signs, phone pressed to her ear and gesturing wildly as she whispered to someone, likely the developer. Her body language was a dead giveaway, she thought she was about to seal the deal. I let her stew for a few hours, knowing full well she'd return under the cover of night to ensure everything was just right before attempting to file anything official with the county. Karen had always believed that darkness and silence were her allies. Tonight, neither would be on her side. Sure enough, just past midnight, my phone pinged with a motion alert. I slipped outside and circled through the woods, careful not to disturb a single twig. I didn't want to spook her too early. When I finally positioned myself behind the old oak tree, I had a perfect view of the barn. There she was, Karen, standing under the faint glow of her flashlight, bolt cutters in one hand, hammer in the other, ready to swap my property markers for her own. In her tote bag were freshly printed signs that read *, private HOA property, no trespassing, development approved. I held my breath as she stepped into the sensor's range. The second the beam detected her movement, all hell broke loose. A blood-curdling choir of goat screams erupted from every corner of the field. But this time, it was paired with the sudden appearance of ghostly holographic goats charging straight at her from the woods. Karen screamed like a horror movie extra, stumbling backward, tripping over her own toolbox and landing flat on her back. The holograms didn't stop, they circled and stampeded like a phantom herd, while the screams echoed so loudly I was sure half the neighborhood would wake up again. And wake up they did. One by one, porch lights flicked on, and neighbors emerged in bathrobes and slippers, staring at the barn where Karen flailed and scrambled to her feet, shrieking about demon goats and witchcraft. She bolted down the path, leaving behind her hammer, bolt cutters, and the bag full of forged signs. I stayed hidden just long enough to see her trip once more, rolling into the ditch near the walking path. It took every ounce of willpower not to burst out laughing. The next day the neighborhood was buzzing. Whispers of Karen's goat encounter spread faster than wildfire. Kids reenacted the scene with homemade goat masks, and someone even updated the community bulletin board with a drawing of Karen being chased by an angry herd. Karen, however, was nowhere to be found. She skipped the usual HOA patrol and avoided her morning walk, but I knew she wouldn't stay gone for long. The woman was stubborn, and besides, the developer wasn't going to wait forever. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around that weekend, the room was packed. More residents showed up than I had ever seen. Karen tried to regain control, standing stiffly behind the podium, insisting that the neighborhood had been attacked by a prankster farmer, meaning me, and that swift action needed to be taken to stop this supposed harassment. I waited patiently, sipping bad coffee and letting her dig her own grave. When it was finally my turn to speak, I pulled out a USB stick and handed it to Linda, the board secretary. The second the footage played on the projector, the room fell dead silent. In glorious high-definition night vision, there was Karen trespassing and hammering signs into the ground, bolt cutters in hand. Frame by frame, they watched her try to doctor my land like it was some abandoned lot, swapping out official markers, placing fraudulent signs, and waving her flashlight around like she was on a treasure hunt. The crowning jewel was her encounter with the holographic goats. Her panicked face lit up as she shrieked, and the whole room erupted in laughter. Karen flailed wildly, her arms swinging as she sprinted from nothing but light and sound. Her face turned a deep shade of purple, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She pointed at me, stammering something about manipulated footage, but it was no use. Greg, bless his heart, slid his chair as far from her as possible, arms crossed, eyes fixed firmly on the floor. Then came the questions. Board members who usually supported her began asking, "Why were you placing unauthorized signs? And how did you get access to HOA funds for this supposed garden without approval? And who is this developer you've been meeting with?" Karen tried to hold on to control, but the room had already turned. Neighbors who once admired her neat flower beds and rigid enforcement were now whispering, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some were visibly angry, while others, especially the older residents, chuckled quietly, clearly savoring every second of her unraveling. The final blow came when the board president, usually one of Karen's staunchest allies, turned to her and asked, "Karen, is there something you want to tell us about this developer?" Cornered and flustered, Karen blurted out, "The deal's already done. It doesn't matter now." Gasps echoed through the room. She had admitted it. She'd cut a deal behind everyone's back, selling out the neighborhood to a developer who planned to pave over part of the community's walking path and green space for profit. In that moment, Karen realized her mistake. Her eyes widened, and for the first time she looked truly afraid. The president leaned back, arms crossed, and simply said, "We'll see about that." I didn't even need to say another word. The footage, the signs, the scheming, it was all there. Karen had walked right into the trap, goats and all. As the meeting descended into chaos with neighbors demanding her removal from the board, Karen just sat there, frozen, watching everything she'd worked for crumble. I knew without a doubt that this wasn't over yet. The real hammer hadn't even dropped, but it was coming, and Karen wasn't going to see it until it was too late. The next few days were a strange blend of chaos and quiet, like the calm after a tornado, when you know another storm is coming but the sky looks deceptively clear. Karen had disappeared from public view, skipping her usual power walks, HOA patrols, and even the Sunday Garden Club meeting, her sacred ritual. Yet, the developer's sleek black SUV remained parked near the neighborhood entrance every evening, engine running like a shark circling its prey. I knew Karen hadn't given up. She was regrouping, desperate to salvage the deal. But I had already made my move. Earlier that week, after the HOA meeting blew up in her face, I had taken the footage, Rick's survey results, and copies of the forged signs straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Daniels was a no-nonsense type, someone who still tipped his hat to folks and treated property rights like sacred law. He didn't need much convincing. The second he saw Karen swinging bolt cutters on private land and bragging about an illegal deal at a public meeting, he nodded slowly and said, "We'll handle it." From that moment, I knew Karen's fate wasn't going to be decided by angry neighbors. It was about to become a matter for the law. On Friday, just before sunset, Sheriff Daniels himself rolled up in his patrol truck and parked right in front of Karen's driveway, lights flashing for all to see. The neighborhood, like clockwork, started peeking through curtains and gathering on the sidewalk. Karen stepped outside, wearing oversized sunglasses and an expression that couldn't decide between defiant and terrified. Daniels wasted no time. He calmly informed her that there was an official complaint against her for trespassing, vandalism, attempted land fraud, and violating county development code. Karen stammered, turning toward Greg, who stood frozen in place. Karen stood in the doorway, holding a casserole like a shield, but what nobody knew was that the developer, realizing the heat was on, had already begun backing away. Rick had quietly sent the corrected survey to the county planning office, ensuring the land records were solid and leaving no room for Karen's fabricated property lines. Without that corner of land behind my barn, the developer's project was doomed. I had seen him the night before leaving town, looking like he had just encountered a ghost, or worse, a herd of ghostly goats. Karen pleaded with the sheriff, insisting it was all a misunderstanding and that she was acting on behalf of the HOA. Daniels raised an eyebrow and simply said, "Ma'am, we have you on camera." Karen's facade cracked like a dropped plate. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as she was issued a citation and warned that further action could be coming, pending a formal review. Greg quietly slipped back inside, casserole still in hand, leaving Karen to face the consequences alone. The fallout was swift. The board called for an emergency vote the very next morning. With only 2 shaky hands raised in her defense, both of which quickly lowered when met with glares, Karen was officially removed as HOA president. It was as if a spell had been broken. The tight-lipped board members who had once followed her lead like sheep suddenly found their voices, openly criticizing her for making backdoor deals and embarrassing the community. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up shared stories of Karen's petty fines, her threats, and how she bullied anyone who dared question her authority. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people again. But I wasn't done, not yet. The following weekend, I organized what I called the first annual goat parade, complete with hayrides, a barbecue, and yes, a guest appearance by a small herd of very real, very loud goats borrowed from my cousin's farm. I half expected a small turnout, maybe a few curious neighbors and some amused kids, but instead the entire neighborhood showed up. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years laughed together as the goats trotted along the walking path, wearing flower garlands and little banners that read things like, "Karen Who?" and "We Love Our Farmer." The atmosphere was electric, filled with the kind of joy that only comes when people realize they're free from the grip of someone who'd made their lives miserable for years. Even Greg showed up, standing quietly near the edge of the crowd with an almost sheepish smile. He didn't say much, but the fact that he was there without Karen said enough. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the last goat was loaded back onto the trailer, I stood by the fence, looking out over the barn and the newly marked property line. The projectors were packed away, the alarms switched off, but the land felt more mine than it ever had before. No HOA tricks, no phony signs, and no Karen breathing down my neck. Just me, my land, and a community that had rediscovered its backbone. Before heading inside, I couldn't resist one last bit of mischief. I walked over to the gate, checked the lock, and then tripped the motion sensor on purpose. The familiar, ridiculous sound of screaming goats filled the air one last time, echoing across the field. To my surprise, laughter erupted from nearby porches. Neighbors cheered and someone even shouted, "Play it again." I obliged. In the distance, behind the curtains of the now strangely quiet house next door, I saw the outline of Karen, staring out at the celebration she would never be part of again. For once, she didn't have anything to say. She just stood there watching, powerless. The war was over and I had won. Not with anger or threats but with goats, just the way it should have been.